The alien tyrant's captive. The throne room of Zorak's palace shimmered under the glow of twin suns. It was a place of unmatched beauty, with walls adorned in rare gemstones and alien metals. Yet, to Carrier, it was a prison. She stood silently behind the tyrant's throne, her posture rigid, her eyes lowered. Her once bright spirit had been dulled by years of servitude under Zorak, the alien overlord feared across the galaxy. Zorak was a towering figure with shimmering blue scales and eyes that burned like molten gold. His voice boomed through the room as he addressed his court, filled with his loyal followers, alien diplomats, war generals, and merchants who thrived on his cruel regime. Carrier was invisible to them, a mere shadow in the tyrant's kingdom, but Zorak often reminded her of her place. "You are a symbol," he had told her once, his sharp claws tracing the chain around her neck. A reminder to all that even humans, with all their defiance, can be broken. Today, Zorak prepared for the intergalactic summit, a gathering of powerful species. He had ordered Carrier to be dressed in ornate robes, her hair styled in the elaborate fashion of his people. She'd hated how they paraded her like a trophy, a reminder of Earth's fall. "Stand tall," Zorak commanded as he adjusted his ceremonial armor. "I want them to see what happens to those who defy me." Carrier obeyed, biting back her resentment. She had learned long ago that defiance came with a price. The scars on her back were proof of that. The summit was held in the Great Hall, a massive chamber with floating platforms and glowing lights. Representatives from dozens of species filled the air with chatter. As Zorak entered, silence fell. He was a force of nature, and no one dared challenge him. Carrier followed a few steps behind, her presence igniting murmurs among the delegates. "Is that?" One alien whispered, its tentacles twitching in surprise. "A human," another replied, "a rare sight these days." Carrier kept her gaze on the ground, pretending not to hear, but she felt the weight of their stares, a mix of pity and curiosity. Zorak took his seat at the head of the table. "Let us begin," he declared, his voice echoing. The summit discussions began, revolving around trade, military alliances, and territorial disputes. Carrier stood silently behind Zorak, her role limited to pouring his drink or holding his ceremonial weapons. As the hours passed, Carrier noticed a change in the atmosphere. Delegates glanced at her more often, their whispers growing louder. She caught fragments of their conversation, words like rebellion and resistance. Her heart skipped a beat. Was there hope? Then it happened. A small, folded piece of paper was slipped into her hand as she refilled a delegate's drink. Carrier's fingers trembled as she quickly hid the note in her sleeve. The delegate, a tall creature with silver eyes, gave her a subtle nod before returning to the discussion. Carrier's mind raced. What could it mean? Was it a trap? Or was it a lifeline? Her pulse quickened as she imagined the possibilities. Could someone out there still be fighting for humanity? Could she be saved? The rest of the summit blurred as Carrier's thoughts spiraled. She barely noticed when Zorak stood to deliver a fiery speech about his dominance and plans to expand his empire. His words, once terrifying, now seemed hollow to her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of something she thought she had lost, hope. As the summit concluded, Zorak rose from his seat. "Come," he ordered, and Carrier followed him out of the hall. She kept her expression neutral, even as the note burned in her sleeve like a secret flame. Back in the palace, Zorak dismissed his guards and advisors. Only Carrier remained as he removed his ceremonial armor. "You were quiet today," he said, his tone suspicious. "I had no reason to speak," Carrier replied softly, careful to keep her voice steady. Zorak studied her for a moment, his golden eyes narrowing. "Good. A slave should know her place." With that, he waved her away. Carrier bowed and left the room, her heart pounding. Once she was alone in her quarters, she pulled out the note with shaking hands. It was written in basic human script, the letters crude but clear. "Help is coming. Be ready." Tears welled in Carrier's eyes as she clutched the note to her chest. She didn't know who had sent it or what their plan was, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, she felt alive. She felt something she thought Zorak had stolen from her forever: hope. But as she hid the note under her mattress, a thought struck her. Zorak was cunning and paranoid. If he found out about this, he wouldn't hesitate to make an example of her. The thought sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now. The palace corridors were silent, save for the faint hum of energy barriers and the distant echoes of alien guards patrolling the halls. Carrier moved cautiously, every step calculated. The note hidden beneath her mattress was her only lifeline, a fragile thread of hope in the midst of despair. But hope alone would not free her. She needed a plan and allies. Days turned into weeks, and the palace routine remained unbroken. Carrier's every movement was watched, her actions monitored. Zorak's paranoia was notorious, and even the faintest misstep could lead to punishment. But Carrier had learned to observe. She noted the changing guard rotations, the moments when Zorak's attention was elsewhere, and the places in the palace where the surveillance systems had blind spots. One evening, as she served drinks to a group of visiting diplomats, Carrier noticed one of the guests, a tall, human-like figure cloaked in shadows, watching her intently. His face was partially obscured, but his piercing green eyes held a message she couldn't ignore. He tipped his head slightly, gesturing toward the far corner of the room. Carrier hesitated, then cautiously followed his gaze. When the meeting ended and the guests began to leave, the cloaked figure brushed past her. His hand slipped something small into her pocket. Carrier's heart raced as she felt the cool, metallic object, a communicator. That night, in the solitude of her quarters, Carrier activated the device. A soft crackle filled the air before a voice spoke, low and urgent. "Carrier, this is Eric. I'm with the Terran Resistance. We've been watching you." "Watching me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why?" "Because you're critical to our mission," Eric replied. "You know Zorak's palace, his routines, his weaknesses. We need you to help us take him down." Carrier's chest tightened. The idea of rebellion, of defying Zorak, felt impossible. "You don't understand. He's too powerful, if he even suspects." "He won't," Eric interrupted. "We've planned for this. All we need is your help to get inside. Once we're in, we'll do the rest." Carrier hesitated, her mind racing. If they failed, it wouldn't just mean death for her. It would mean the destruction of anyone who dared to resist Zorak. But the alternative was to remain a prisoner, a symbol of humanity's defeat. "What do I have to do?" she finally asked. Eric's voice softened. "We'll guide you. For now, stay alert. When the time comes, you'll know." The days that followed were a blur of tension and fear. Carrier continued her duties, maintaining the facade of a loyal servant, while secretly preparing for the rebellion. She memorized escape routes, smuggled small items that could be useful, and listened for any hint of Zorak's plans. The Resistance's instructions came sporadically through the communicator, each message brief and precise. Then the night arrived. The palace was quieter than usual, the guards unusually relaxed. Carrier felt the weight of the communicator in her pocket as she approached Zorak's chambers. The plan was simple but dangerous. Create a distraction that would draw Zorak and his forces away from the palace, allowing the Resistance to infiltrate unnoticed. Carrier slipped into the main hall, her heart pounding. She activated the communicator, whispering, "I'm in position." Eric's voice crackled in response. "Good. Plant the device under the central console. Once it's activated, get out." The device was small, no larger than her palm, but it carried enough energy to disable the palace's entire security grid for several minutes. Carrier crouched near the console, her hands steady despite the chaos in her mind. She pressed the device into place and activated it with a soft click. A low hum filled the air, followed by a sudden surge of light as the palace's energy systems flickered. Alarms blared, and Carrier slipped into the shadows, her breath shallow. She could hear the guards shouting, their footsteps echoing as they rushed to investigate. Outside the palace, Eric and his team waited. Their ship, cloaked and silent, hovered just beyond the palace's defenses. "The grid is down," Eric confirmed, watching as the security barriers flickered and died. "Move in." Carrier watched from a hidden alcove as the resistance fighters entered the palace, their movements swift and precise. For the first time, she saw humans fighting back against the tyranny that had enslaved them. It was a sight that filled her with both awe and determination. But the victory was short-lived. Zorak, ever the strategist, had anticipated an attack. His forces, hidden within the palace walls, emerged in droves, cutting off the resistance's escape route. Carrier's communicator buzzed with Eric's voice, strained but firm. "We've been compromised. Carrier, you need to get out now." "No," she whispered, clutching the device. "I can help." "You've done enough," Eric replied. "We'll handle this. Just go." Carrier's mind raced. She had risked everything for this moment, and now it was slipping away. But as she watched the resistance fighters holding their ground, something inside her shifted. She wasn't just a pawn in this game, she was a fighter too. She pressed the communicator to her lips. "I'm not leaving. Tell me what to do." Freedom at a cost. The palace was in chaos. Smoke filled the air, mingling with the sharp scent of burned circuitry and alien chemicals. Resistance fighters clashed with Zorak's elite guards, their weapons lighting up the grand halls with bursts of energy. Amid the chaos, Carrier moved with newfound determination, every step taking her closer to a future she had almost forgotten how to dream about. Eric's voice crackled over the communicator in her ear. "Carrier, head to the east wing. There's an auxiliary exit we can use to evacuate." Carrier glanced around, her mind racing. The east wing was heavily guarded. Zorak always stationed his most loyal soldiers there. "That's a death trap," she replied, ducking behind a column as an explosion rocked the hall. "It's our only way out," Eric said firmly. "We've already planted charges to clear the path. Just get there." Carrier took a deep breath and darted toward the east wing. The path was treacherous, filled with collapsed walls and injured fighters. She passed a fallen resistance member, a young woman clutching a makeshift weapon. Her wide, glassy eyes reflected the price of freedom. Carrier hesitated, guilt stabbing at her, but she knew she couldn't stop. Survival was their only chance to keep fighting. As she reached the east wing, a low growl stopped her in her tracks. A massive alien guard, one of Zorak's personal enforcers, blocked her path. The creature stood over 8 feet tall, its muscular frame bristling with jagged armor. Its eyes locked onto her, filled with a predator's hunger. "You will not leave this place alive," it snarled. The fight was brutal. Carrier was no warrior, but desperation made her resourceful. She dodged the creature's attacks, using the debris around her as makeshift weapons. A jagged piece of metal became a blade in her hands, and she slashed at the guard's exposed flesh. Each strike was fueled by years of anger and pain, every blow a rebellion against the chains that had bound her. Finally, with a deafening roar, the creature fell. Carrier stood over its lifeless body, her chest heaving. Blood, both hers and the guards, spattered her clothes, but she didn't have time to dwell on her victory. The path was clear, and she needed to move. Eric and the remaining resistance fighters were waiting near the auxiliary exit, their faces grim but determined. "You made it," Eric said, relief softening his tone. "Barely," Carrier replied, her voice steady despite the chaos still raging behind them. The group moved quickly, exiting the palace and heading toward their cloaked ship, but their escape wasn't unnoticed. Zorak himself appeared on the palace balcony, his golden eyes glowing with fury. "You dare defy me?" He roared, his voice amplified by the palace's systems. "You think you can escape my wrath? You will pay for this insolence." Carrier's heart raced as she saw Zorak raise his hand. A beam of searing energy shot toward them, striking the ground just inches from their ship. The explosion threw Carrier and the others off their feet, the force knocking the wind out of her. "Get up," Eric shouted, pulling her to her feet. "We're almost there." The group scrambled onto the ship, but not without casualties. Several resistance members didn't make it, their bodies left behind in the smoking ruins of the palace grounds. Carrier felt a pang of guilt, knowing they had sacrificed their lives for this chance at freedom. As the ship lifted off, Zorak's forces opened fire. The hull rattled with each hit, alarms blaring as the pilots struggled to stabilize the vessel. Carrier gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles white. She had dreamed of escaping for so long, but now that it was happening, she felt only fear and uncertainty. "We're not out of this yet," Eric said, his voice tense. "Zorak will send everything he has after us. We need to reach the colony before we're intercepted." Carrier's stomach churned. She had heard whispers of the human colony, a hidden refuge where the last remnants of Earth's people gathered. But she had also heard stories of Zorak's vengeance. No one who defied him was ever truly safe. As the ship entered hyperspace, the crew began to assess the damage. Supplies were low, and the wounded outnumbered the healthy. Eric approached Carrier, his expression serious. "You did well back there," he said. "Without you, we wouldn't have made it." Carrier shook her head. "We lost so many. I don't know if this is freedom or just another form of survival." "It's both," Eric admitted, "but it's a start, and for us, that's everything." Carrier looked out the window, watching the stars streak past. For the first time in years, she was free from Zorak's chains, but the weight of her choices hung heavy on her shoulders. Freedom had come at a cost, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to pay the full price. In the quiet moments after the battle, Carrier found herself alone, holding the communicator that had brought her this far. She thought of the resistance fighters who had fallen, the lives that had been lost for a cause they believed in. She thought of Zorak, his fury still burning in her mind, and the promise of his revenge. As the ship hurtled toward the colony, Carrier made a silent vow. She would honor the sacrifices of those who had saved her. She would fight, not just for her own freedom, but for the freedom of everyone still living under Zorak's tyranny. The battle for freedom had begun, but the war was far from over. A new beginning. The ship's engines roared as it entered the atmosphere of a remote, barren planet. From the viewport, Carrier could see clusters of structures hidden within a sprawling canyon. This was the colony, the last stronghold of humanity. It wasn't the lush paradise she imagined in her dreams of freedom, but it was a place where humans lived without fear of chains or whips. The ship landed with a jarring thud. Eric and the others moved quickly, unloading supplies and carrying the injured toward the settlement. Carrie hesitated, her feet frozen on the ramp as she took in the sight of her new reality. People, many of them scared and wary, moved with purpose through the dusty paths of the colony. Their faces carried the weight of survival, but also something she hadn't seen in years, hope. "Welcome home," Eric said, standing beside her. His voice was kind, but his eyes were sharp, studying her reaction. "This is home," Carrier whispered, the words catching in her throat. "It's what we've got," Eric replied. "It's not much, but it's ours." The next few days were a blur of introductions and adjustments. Carrier met the leaders of the colony, a mix of hardened veterans and young idealists who had dedicated their lives to the resistance. They greeted her with cautious optimism, acknowledging her bravery but wary of her past as Zorak's captive. Carrier was given a small room in one of the underground bunkers, a stark contrast to the lavish but oppressive chambers she had known in Zorak's palace. The walls were bare, the bed little more than a cot, but for the first time in years, the air around her felt free. The colony's routines were grueling. Every person contributed, from farming in the hydroponic gardens to repairing machinery scavenged from abandoned outposts. Carrier struggled to find her place. Her hands were unsteady with the tools, her muscles weak from years of malnourishment. Some colonists whispered behind her back, questioning her usefulness. "She's a liability," one man muttered as Carrier passed. "She's been through enough," another argued. "Give her time." But time was a luxury the colony couldn't afford. Zorak's forces would eventually discover their location, and every day was a race to prepare for the inevitable attack. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the canyon, Carrier found herself sitting alone on a rocky ledge overlooking the colony. Eric joined her, carrying 2 mugs of steaming liquid. He handed one to her and sat down. "You've been quiet," he said, breaking the silence. "I don't know where I belong," Carrier admitted, staring into her mug. "I thought freedom would feel different." Eric nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Freedom isn't easy. It's messy and complicated, but it's worth fighting for." Carrier looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "How do you keep going, after everything we've lost?" "Because we have no choice," Eric replied. "If we don't fight, we lose everything. And because of people like you, we still have a chance." Carrier's chest tightened. She had spent so long feeling powerless, but here, among these people, she began to see a spark of something she had forgotten: purpose. The colony's fragile peace was shattered days later when a scout ship returned with grim news. A Zoratian patrol had been spotted near the sector, searching for signs of human activity. Panic rippled through the settlement. The leaders called an emergency meeting, their voices rising as they debated their next move. Carrier sat at the edge of the room, listening intently. She felt the familiar weight of fear pressing on her chest, but this time she didn't let it consume her. "We need to prepare for evacuation," one leader said. "We can't risk being found." "And go where?" another argued. "This is our home." Eric stood, his voice calm but firm. "We don't need to run. We've faced worse before. If Zorak sends his forces, we'll be ready." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled over them. Carrier felt a surge of respect for Eric. He wasn't just a fighter. He was a leader who believed in their strength, even when hope seemed fragile. That night, Carrier approached Eric as he prepared for a reconnaissance mission. "I want to help," she said, her voice steady. Eric raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? It's dangerous out there." "I'm sure," Carrier replied. "I've spent too long hiding. If Zorak is coming, I need to be ready to face him." Eric studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's see what you've got." The mission was a test of Carrier's resolve. She and Eric scouted the outer perimeter of the canyon, searching for signs of enemy activity. The desert night was cold and silent, the air thick with tension. Carrier's senses were sharp, every sound and shadow a potential threat. As they moved through the rocky terrain, Eric explained the colony's defensive strategies. Carrier listened intently, absorbing every detail. She realized how much she still had to learn, but for the first time, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. "Why are you doing this for me?" Carrier asked as they returned to the colony. "Because you're one of us now," Eric replied simply, "and we don't leave our own behind." Back at the colony, Carrier's confidence grew. She volunteered for tasks she once thought impossible, from repairing equipment to training with the fighters. The whispers of doubt faded as she proved herself, her resilience earning the respect of those around her. But even as she found her place among the colonists, Carrier couldn't shake the feeling that Zorak was still watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The scars of her past ran deep, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never let herself be a victim again. The colony had given her a chance at a new beginning, and she was determined to fight for it. The Tyrant's revenge. The calm within the colony was short-lived. It began with a faint, almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through the ground. At first, the colonists thought it was another storm brewing in the canyon, a natural occurrence they had learned to endure. But as the sound grew louder, carrying a mechanical edge, panic spread like wildfire. Eric burst into the central hub, his expression grim. "They found us," he announced, his voice cutting through the growing commotion. "Zorak's forces are closing in." The colony sprang into action. Sirens blared, and people rushed to their stations. Fighters armed themselves, while others ushered children and non-combatants into hidden bunkers. The air buzzed with fear and determination. Carrier stood among the chaos, her mind racing. This was the moment she had feared since her escape, but it was also the moment she had vowed to face. "Carrier," Eric called, tossing her a blaster. "You're with me." She caught the weapon, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. "What's the plan?" "We hold them off as long as we can," Eric replied, his jaw set. "The civilians need time to evacuate. If we're lucky, they won't breach the inner defenses." Carrier nodded, swallowing her fear. She followed Eric to the outer perimeter, where a group of fighters had already taken positions. The hum grew into a deafening roar as Zorak's warships appeared over the horizon, their sleek forms cutting through the sky. The first wave of attackers descended with precision, alien soldiers equipped with advanced weaponry. The colonists fired back, their makeshift defenses holding strong for now. Carrier stayed close to Eric, her hands trembling as she aimed her blaster. Her first shot went wide, but the second found its mark, striking a soldier square in the chest. The realization that she had killed hit her like a punch to the gut, but there was no time to dwell on it. Eric placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're doing great. Just keep going." The battle raged on, each passing moment pushing the colonists closer to their limits. Explosions rocked the canyon, sending debris raining down. Carrier's ears rang as she ducked behind cover, her heart pounding. For every attacker they took down, it seemed two more appeared. Zorak's forces were relentless. As the colonists fought, a message came through the comms. One of the scouts, stationed at a lookout point, had spotted Zorak himself. He stood on the command deck of a massive warship, his golden eyes scanning the battlefield with icy precision. Carrier felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that look. Zorak wasn't just here to destroy the colony, he was here for her. A sudden explosion shattered the outer wall, and the enemy poured into the settlement. Eric shouted orders, rallying the fighters to fall back and protect the bunkers. Carrier found herself face to face with an alien soldier, its weapon raised. Without thinking, she lunged forward, using the butt of her blaster to knock it off balance. The soldier fell, but another took its place. "Carrier, move." Eric yelled, pulling her out of harm's way as a plasma blast scorched the ground where she had stood. The colonists retreated to the inner defenses, but even there, safety was fleeting. Zorak's forces were equipped with technology far beyond anything the resistance could match. The bunker doors strained under the relentless assault, their reinforced steel glowing red-hot from sustained energy blasts. Amid the chaos, Carrier's communicator buzzed with an incoming message. She pressed it to her ear, her breath catching when she heard the voice on the other end. "Carrier," Zorak's deep, menacing voice filled the line. "Did you really think you could escape me? Did you think these humans could protect you?" Her grip tightened on the communicator. "You'll never win," she spat, her voice trembling but defiant. Zorak chuckled darkly. "Brave words for someone who owes her life to my mercy. Return to me, and I'll consider sparing the others. Resist, and I will destroy everything you hold dear." The line went dead, leaving Carrier shaken but resolute. She turned to Eric, who had been listening. "He's bluffing," Eric said. "He always bluffs." Carrier's jaw clenched. "No, he's not. Zorak doesn't bluff." Desperation crept into the colonists' ranks as the enemy closed in. Eric and the leaders debated their next move, their voices tense. Some argued for surrender, while others refused to give up. "We fight," Eric said firmly. "We've come too far to give in now." Carrier stepped forward, her voice cutting through the heated discussion. "I can buy us time." Eric turned to her, his expression unreadable. "What are you talking about?" "Zorak wants me," Carrier said. "If I go to him, he might pull his forces back. It'll give you time to evacuate." "No," Eric said immediately. We're not sacrificing you. This isn't your choice, Carrier replied, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. If it means saving these people, I'll do it. Eric grabbed her arm, his eyes blazing. You're not going back to him. Not after everything you've been through. Carrier met his gaze, her own eyes filled with determination. I'm not going back as his slave. I'm going back to end this. The part ends with Carrier walking toward the battlefield, her figure silhouetted against the burning ruins of the colony. The audience is left wondering what plan she has in mind and whether she will succeed or fall into Zorak's clutches once again. The final battle. Carrier stepped onto the battlefield, her heart pounding like a war drum. Every step felt heavier than the last as she approached the enemy lines. Behind her, the colony burned, its defenses crumbling under Zorak's relentless assault. The colonists needed time, and she was their only hope. Zorak's forces noticed her approach. The front line of alien soldiers halted, their glowing weapons trained on her. A tense silence fell over the battlefield, broken only by the distant rumble of explosions. Carrier kept walking, her chin held high despite the fear coursing through her veins. From above, Zorak watched with a cruel smile. His warship hovered ominously over the battlefield, its shadow stretching across the canyon like the hand of a vengeful god. He motioned to his guards, "Bring her to me." A transport ship descended, flanked by two smaller fighters. Carrier stopped in her tracks, the cold wind tugging at her hair as the transport landed. The ship's door slid open, revealing a squad of armored soldiers. Their leader, a towering figure with gleaming armor, stepped forward. "Carrier of Earth," the alien boomed. "By the command of Lord Zorak, you will come with us." Carrier raised her hands in mock surrender. "I'll come," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to speak to Zorak directly." The soldiers exchanged glances but ultimately complied. They escorted her onto the transport, the hum of its engines filling the air as it lifted off. Through the small window, Carrier saw the colony growing smaller below her. She clenched her fists, silently vowing that this would not be the end. Inside Zorak's warship, the atmosphere was cold and sterile. Carrier was led through gleaming corridors, the alien guards flanking her like statues. They stopped before an enormous door, which slid open to reveal the throne room. Zorak sat on a raised platform, his golden eyes glowing with triumph. "Carrier," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You've come back to me. How touching." Carrier met his gaze, refusing to let him see her fear. "I didn't come to beg," she said. "I came to end this." Zorak laughed, a deep, menacing sound that echoed through the chamber. "And how do you plan to do that? You're alone, unarmed and powerless." "Am I?" Carrier asked, a small, defiant smile playing on her lips. Unknown to Zorak, Carrier had smuggled a device from the colony, a disruptor capable of overloading the ship's systems. Hidden in her clothing, it was her one chance to turn the tide. She had activated it during the flight, setting it on a timer. The device would detonate any moment now, but she needed to keep Zorak distracted. "You underestimate humans," she said, stepping closer to the throne. "We're more than slaves. We're survivors, fighters, and we don't stop until we win." Zorak leaned forward, intrigued. Bold words, but words won't save your precious colony. Carrier held his gaze. "No, actions will." The ship suddenly lurched, the lights flickering as the disruptor activated. Alarms blared, and Zorak's smug expression turned to one of anger. "What have you done?" he roared, rising from his throne. Carrier stood her ground, even as the guards surrounded her. "Your reign ends here, Zorak." The ship's systems began to fail, sparks flying from the control panels. Carrier used the chaos to her advantage, grabbing a fallen guard's weapon and firing at the remaining soldiers. She moved with a precision she didn't know she had, every shot aimed with purpose. Meanwhile, Eric and the colonists launched a coordinated counterattack. With Zorak's forces distracted and his ship's defenses down, they struck with everything they had. Explosions lit up the canyon as the colonists fought to reclaim their home. Eric's voice crackled over Carrier's communicator. "We've breached their lines. Are you okay?" "I'm still alive," Carrier replied, dodging a blast from one of Zorak's guards. "But this isn't over yet." "Hold on," Eric said. "We're coming for you." As the ship continued to fall apart, Zorak confronted Carrier. He moved with inhuman speed, his golden eyes blazing with fury. "You think you can defeat me?" he snarled. "I am the future. I am power." Carrier raised her weapon, her hands steady despite the terror she felt. "You're nothing but a tyrant, and tyrants always fall." Zorak lunged at her, his claws slashing through the air. Carrier narrowly avoided the attack, using the terrain to her advantage. The throne room became a battlefield, the two of them locked in a deadly dance. Finally, Carrier spotted an exposed power core behind the throne. It was the ship's weak point. The disruptor had destabilized it, but it needed one final blow. As Zorak lunged again, she dodged and fired her weapon at the core. The explosion was immediate, throwing them both to the ground. Carrier scrambled to her feet, smoke and fire filling the room. Zorak lay wounded, his golden eyes dimming. "You will regret this," he hissed. Carrier stood over him, her voice cold. "Not today." She turned and ran, her communicator buzzing with Eric's voice. "The ship's going down. Get out of there." A regular life at last. The escape pod hissed as its hatch opened, spilling smoke into the dawn-lit sky. Carrier stumbled out, coughing, her legs barely holding her up. The distant sound of Zorak's warship exploding still echoed in her ears, a symphony of chaos that marked the end of the Tyrant's reign. Behind her, the horizon glowed with the remnants of the battle. The colonists' improvised forces had won against impossible odds, driving Zorak's army into retreat. But Carrier had no time to process the victory. Her communicator buzzed, Eric's familiar voice crackling through the static. "Carrier, are you alive?" His tone was frantic, but there was hope in it. "I'm here," she replied, her voice weak but steady. "Zorak's gone. The ship. It's over." Eric exhaled a laugh, relief washing over his words. "Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you." Hours later, the colonists regrouped at the edge of the canyon, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Survivors hugged each other, tears streaming down dirty faces. The losses were heavy, but the victory was theirs. They had done the impossible. They had defied Zorak and survived. Carrier sat on a rock, staring out at the smoldering wreckage in the distance. She felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but also a strange emptiness. The chains of her past were broken, yet she wondered if she truly knew how to live without them. Eric approached, a med kit in one hand and a flask of water in the other. He crouched beside her, inspecting a cut on her forehead. "You're a mess," he said with a small smile. "I've been worse," Carrier replied, her lips curling into a faint grin. "You did it, you know," Eric said, his tone softening. "You didn't just survive, you saved us." Carrier shook her head. "We all did it. I couldn't have done it without you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of rebuilding and reflection. The colonists worked tirelessly to repair their settlement, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that Zorak's shadow no longer loomed over them. Carrier threw herself into the effort, helping where she could, though she still felt like an outsider at times. One evening, as the first stars appeared in the sky, the colony gathered for a ceremony to honor the fallen. Names were read aloud, their memories etched into the hearts of the survivors. Carrier stood silently in the back, her hands clenched as she thought of those who had sacrificed everything for this moment. When the ceremony ended, Eric found her sitting alone by the fire. He handed her a bowl of soup and sat beside her. "You don't have to do this alone," he said after a long silence. "Do what?" Carrier asked, staring into the flames. "Figure out what comes next," Eric replied. "You're not just a survivor anymore, Carrier. You're free. That's something worth living for." Carrier met his gaze, her heart tightening. For so long, she had defined herself by her captivity, her survival. But now she had a chance to build something new. Over time, Carrier began to find her place in the colony. She discovered she had a knack for strategy, helping Eric and the other leaders plan defenses and organize resources. She also grew close to the colonists, her once cautious demeanor softening as she let herself trust again. But the biggest change came when she allowed herself to dream. Carrier found herself imagining a future, one where she wasn't defined by her past. A future where she could be more than a symbol of defiance, where she could simply be herself. One night, Eric invited her to a quiet spot on the canyon's edge. The two of them sat under the stars, the air cool and still. Eric handed her a small carved pendant. "We don't have much, but I wanted you to have this," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shy. Carrier took the pendant, her fingers tracing the intricate design. "What is it?" "A reminder," Eric said, "that no matter what happens, you'll always have a place here. With us, with me." Carrier's throat tightened. She had spent so long feeling like she didn't belong, like her freedom was a borrowed gift. But in this moment, she felt something she hadn't in years: peace. As the colony rebuilt, life slowly began to settle into a rhythm. The scars of war remained, but so did the hope that had carried them through it. Carrier became an integral part of the community, her courage and resilience inspiring others. And then one day, she realized something extraordinary. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. The story closes with Carrier and Eric standing together at the canyon's edge, watching the sun rise over their rebuilt home. The dawn light paints the world in warm hues, a symbol of the new beginning they fought so hard to create. "I used to think freedom was just a dream," Carrier said softly, "but now it feels real." Eric smiled, his hand brushing hers. "That's because it is." Together, they turned back toward the colony, ready to face whatever came next, not as warriors, but as people who had reclaimed their humanity and found something worth fighting for.